Of course, Donald Trump just couldn't resist. And so tonight at a rally in Mississippi, he started mocking Dr. Christine Blasey Ford on his rally stage, and he reduced her hours of credible testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee to just one line in which she said, credibly, that she had only one beer that night. And so Donald Trump kept repeating that line, I had one beer. I had one beer. And in a rant against Dr. Ford. And so if you take your children to a Trump rally now, you're going to have to explain to them what gang rape is, if they don't already know, because Donald Trump also boomed the words gang rape repeatedly. The only president in history to use the words gang rape in a political speech, the only president in history to use the words gang rape to try to score political points. And we have that video of what Donald Trump said in Mississippi, and it is pure presidential pornography. It is vile. It is poison. A deeply perverted, self-confessed sexual assaulter mocking the very concept of sexual assault to a cheering crowd that includes children in Mississippi. Some of you might want to see it. You might want to see him saying those words. You can find it online. I don't want to see it again. I've seen it once. I don't ever want to see it again. And I have an editorial function here, and I have decided to not show you the horrible words of that deeply disgraceful man and the people who cheered that man, who they have all heard describe his own favorite methods of sexual assault. And so I will not be staining this program tonight with the poison spewed by the President of the United States. The country is focusing on the high school and college drinking habits of a 53-year-old man tonight, because that man is now a Supreme Court nominee who stands credibly accused of criminal sexual aggressiveness in high school and in college while he was very, very drunk. In his defense, Brett Kavanaugh minimized his drinking in high school and college. There was nothing Brett Kavanaugh was more defensive about than his drinking. Brett Kavanaugh definitively answered questions about sexual assault and said very, very clearly that Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's accusation that he attempted to rape her in high school was absolutely untrue. Brett Kavanaugh was very clear about that. But he tried to stay as vague as possible about his drinking and actually refused to answer several questions about his drinking. Dr. Ford's description of Brett Kavanaugh's conduct in high school and Deborah Ramirez's description of Brett Kavanaugh's sexual aggression against her in college both describe two parts of Brett Kavanaugh's conduct in those situations. One of those things is extreme drunkenness, and the other is sexual aggressiveness and sexual assault. And if you don't think that Brett Kavanaugh's drinking is an important part of the investigation of that conduct, if you don't think Brett Kavanaugh's high school and college drinking is an important part of the equation that we are all trying to solve, imagine if Brett Kavanaugh could actually say this about his high school and college drinking.
I never had a glass of alcohol. I've never had alcohol.
If Donald Trump was now accused of sexual assault in high school or college while he was stumbling drunk, Donald Trump would have a very strong first line of defense, which is, I've never been drunk. Therefore, half of the accusation against him is false. Half of the description of his conduct is false. Why did Brett Kavanaugh decide before his under oath testimony last week that he absolutely could not answer questions about his drinking in an honest and straightforward way, that he would have to be evasive, that he would have to actually refuse to answer some of those questions? And it was definitely a premeditated strategy. It had to be, because it was already public information that Brett Kavanaugh's high school friend, Mark Judge, who Dr. Ford says joined the attempted rape that she suffered, wrote a 2005 memoir called God and Man at Georgetown Prep, in which he said that their high school was, quote, positively swimming in alcohol. And that's not the only thing that Mark Judge wrote. He also wrote a book called Wasted, Tales of a Gen X Drunk, in which he described being a blackout alcoholic during high school when he was best friends with and partying with Brett Kavanaugh. In that book, Mark Judge describes a friend named Bart O'Kavanaugh, who passed out and puked in a car. In his testimony under oath last week, Brett Kavanaugh denied that he ever blacked out or passed out from drunkenness. He did allow that he fell asleep. That's what he said, fell asleep after drinking sometimes. Senator Patrick Leahy repeatedly asked Brett Kavanaugh if he was the Bart O'Kavanaugh described in Mark Judge's memoir of his high school years. And Brett Kavanaugh parried the question and evaded the question and rambled on in other directions and refused to answer the question, went on a long ramble about Mark Kavanaugh's problems with alcohol, and then Senator Leahy zeroed in on it for one final try.
Judge Kavanaugh, I'm trying to get a straight answer from you under oath. Are you Brett Kavanaugh that he's referring to? Yes or no?
You'd have to ask him.
Well, I agree with you there.
Are you Bart Kavanaugh, yes or no? You'd have to ask him. The "are you Bart" question has tonight become yet another example of why Chuck Grassley and Mitch McConnell were desperately trying to rush the vote on the Kavanaugh nomination last week, because every day that goes by, a new fact emerges that hurts the testimony of that Brett Kavanaugh gave under oath. And tonight, the New York Times has the smoking gun on the Bart question. It's not the biggest question in the Kavanaugh investigation, but Brett Kavanaugh made it a question, a continuing question, by refusing to answer the question under oath. He was afraid of that question. You'll have to ask him. He was afraid to answer that question, and now we know why. Bart was not the pseudonym for Brett Kavanaugh that Mark Judge invented for that book so that he wouldn't use the real names of his friends in his high school memoir. Mark Judge didn't invent that pseudonym. Bart was his real name. That was his real name among his friends. The New York Times reports tonight that Brett Kavanaugh was, quote, nicknamed Bart after a Georgetown prep teacher garbled Brett. And you don't have to take the New York Times word for that. The New York Times has discovered a letter that Brett Kavanaugh wrote to his friends in high school about their arrangements for Beach Week, when they all planned to get very, very drunk for a week together at a rented condo at the beach. He carefully explained that each of the 8 of them renting the condo together each owed another $50 to make the final payment on the condo. He explained how they were going to need their own towels, sheets, pillowcases, blankets. He explained that he was going to arrive late because he was going to be returning from a family trip to Ireland. And that handwritten letter was signed Bart. There it is, in his own handwriting. And so, no, we don't have to ask Mark Judge if Brett was Bart, because Brett put it in writing. His own handwriting. What if Senator Leahy had this letter in his hands when he was asking Brett Kavanaugh, were you Bart? 5 days after Pat Leahy asked that question, this letter has surfaced. 5 days. That is why Mitch McConnell wanted the vote last week. That is why Mitch McConnell wanted the vote yesterday. That is why Mitch McConnell wants the vote as fast as possible, because every single day something new comes out that shows Brett Kavanaugh was not telling the truth in the Senate Judiciary Committee and was provably not telling the truth about his own drinking. And when he was in high school, Bart Kavanaugh was not so reluctant to describe his drinking, not as reluctant as he was under oath in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, because right under Bart's signature in that handwritten letter is a P.S., and in that P.S. he says it would be a good idea to, quote, warn the neighbors that we're loud, obnoxious drunks with prolific pukers among us. Bart Kavanaugh could have said under oath last week that when he was in high school, oh yeah, by the way, they called me Bart, and I was a loud, obnoxious drunk, but never raped anyone. Most loud, obnoxious drunks never rape anyone. We all know plenty of loud, obnoxious drunks in high school who never attempted to rape anyone. But Brett Kavanaugh, for some strange reason, is afraid to tell us the truth about his drinking. And the trouble is, he was under oath when he was supposed to be telling us the truth about his drinking. And now he wants to be a Supreme Court justice where he will have to rule on perjury cases. He will have to rule on cases involving people who lied to the FBI. Brett Kavanaugh told the country under oath that he was a harmless beer drinker in high school and college. He said he was a legal beer drinker in his senior year in high school because the drinking age was 18, and every bit of that has been proven to be a lie. Brett Kavanaugh never had a legal drink until he was 21. The drinking age in Maryland was not 18 when Brett Kavanaugh was a senior in high school. Witnesses to Brett Kavanaugh's drinking in high school and college agree with Brett Kavanaugh that Brett Kavanaugh was a loud, obnoxious drunk and a prolific puker, as he put it in his own words, in writing, in high school, in that letter that we just saw. And the only reason we're talking about any of this now is that Brett Kavanaugh lied about it under oath last week, and we don't know why he lied about it. Because Bart Kavanaugh's high school drinking and Brett Kavanaugh's college drinking wasn't anything terribly strange. We all know guys who drank like that in high school and in college. I had friends who drank much more than that in high school, including one dear friend who drank himself to death in his 30s. And he started in high school, like Brett Kavanaugh. Drinking and raping are two very different things. But does Brett Kavanaugh think they're the same thing? Does Brett Kavanaugh think they go together? Why would he think that? Why does Brett Kavanaugh feel so guilty about his drinking that he's willing to run the risk of lying about it under oath? You'll notice that he was not willing to run the risk of lying to Senator Leahy and say, no, he was not Bart, because he knew there were dozens of witnesses from his high school who could testify that, oh, yeah, he was Bart when he was in high school. And some of those witnesses have told that to the New York Times now. And the New York Times has Bart's signature in writing. And so Brett Kavanaugh was alert enough to not perjure himself when answering the question, were you Bart? He just refused to answer it. Something he could never get away with in a courtroom, but something he could get away with again and again in that hearing room. Because the hearing room is not a courtroom. It does not use the rules of a courtroom. But now Republicans want to use the standard of a criminal courtroom to decide the nomination of a Supreme Court justice. They want to say that if you cannot prosecute a criminal case of rape against Brett Kavanaugh, then he should be a Supreme Court justice, even if there are very strong, credible accusations that Brett Kavanaugh did commit the attempted rape of Dr. Ford and did commit a sexual assault against Deborah Ramirez at Yale. The FBI has been ordered to rush its new investigation of Brett Kavanaugh. We don't know if the FBI would have found Bart Kavanaugh's handwritten high school letter if the New York Times didn't find it for them today. We might never know what the FBI has found because normally FBI background reports on nominees are not made public. And that is the plan for this new FBI report on Brett Kavanaugh. 100 senators can read it and no one else. The New York Times is reporting that the FBI report could be completed as early as tomorrow. And Mitch McConnell is still promising a vote on the nomination this week, at least a procedural vote this week. And every day matters for Mitch McConnell because every day is another day when we might learn something more damaging about Bart. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.